All right. So again, thank you very much for attending the launch of the Interim Principle for Responsible Carbon Finance. Many of you have been involved in the process starting for less than 6 months ago. Quite a lot's been achieved, and we will go through the overall process and where we've got to. So thank you again for all your contributions and the time that you've given to this process. My name is Faisal Hussain, and we will have colleagues across CCA contributing to the so we will have, can I just ask as a piece of housekeeping, if you could mute your mics, then yeah, that would be helpful. Thank you. So in terms of agenda today, we will have spend a little bit of time with Divna van der Lans, our CEO, giving us opening remarks about both the initiative and sort of the role of CCA and yourselves. Then Ronan Ferguson, who's been the task manager for this initiative, will be taking us through the rationale and the process that we've gone through, just to remind ourselves why we did it, and the sort of the structured process we used to get where we've got to. I will then come in to take you through the interim principles themselves, and then talk through the next steps. And then we'll have a substantial session for Q&A, and we will try to answer as much as we can within the 15-20 minutes we might have for Q&A. And those questions that we cannot answer, we commit to giving the answers through email in an open way through. So thank you very much. So just one thing, that we have French interpretation happening at the same time. So those of you, sorry that we couldn't do all the languages, the UN languages, but hopefully this will contribute to at least our French colleagues in in Europe and West Africa primarily, or Central Africa. So okay, with that, let me hand over to Divna. For Divna, your opening remarks.
Thanks, Faisal. Good morning. It's really great to join you this morning for this really important discussion. And it's just amazing, actually, to see how far it has progressed in the last less than 6 months, which is truly remarkable. I think we all know that carbon finance is transforming our sector. In our forthcoming industry snapshot, we report that investment in clean cooking enterprises grew dramatically to an all-time high of $215 million in 2022. Carbon finance is a key driver behind that uptick in investment over the last 2 years. 2022 also was a record-breaking year for sector revenue. $104 million was earned last year. And carbon finance is also fueling this revenue growth by increasing demand from project developers for high-quality products from manufacturers. Carbon financing is being used to make clean and improved cooking solutions more affordable. There are, however, immediate and future risks that we should all be mindful of. Buyer perceptions of quality is weighing on clean cooking carbon credit prices, which is directly impacting the economics of clean cooking enterprises and associated carbon projects. As a sector, we must also look to ensure the generation of high-quality carbon credits from clean cooking projects that end buyers can procure with the utmost trust and confidence. Let's not lose sight of the fact that carbon finance is a temporary solution. It's a proven means for enterprises to get to scale, but not an end in and of itself. We must also be careful to look beyond carbon revenue to create a sustainable industry in the longer-term future. To increase buyer confidence in clean cooking carbon projects, CCA launched the Responsible Carbon Finance for Clean Cooking initiative. Over the summer, many of you participated in this initiative. We had engagements from working groups consisting of over 530 stakeholders, representing 267 institutions from across clean and improved cooking and carbon markets. With big thanks to our 8 co-chairs, we've distilled 12 principles across 4 themes that outline how the industry can increase buyer confidence that clean and improved cooking carbon credits are high quality. Looking forward, CCA is committed to taking these interim principles through further industry consolidation, where they ultimately will become finalized principles. CCA looks forward to taking these finalized principles and developing them into new voluntary code of conduct for clean cooking carbon finance. Thank you all for your participation, and thank you also for Ronan and Faisal for your leadership in this really critical process. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dupna. One additional member I should mention, many of you will have engaged with Eliza Darby. She's been driving our 4C work, so she's also been a major contributor to our thinking on one of the themes around integrity, actually the whole thing as well. So we're really pleased that we have her for this process, and also to respond to questions we might have about how this integrates into wider methodologies. So with that, let me hand over to Ronan to take us through why we did this and the process we followed. So over to you, Ronan.
Great. Thanks, Faisal. You can hear me okay? All right. Well, that's brilliant. Hello, everyone. So over the next 10 minutes, I'm going to give you a bit of the background around how we got to these interim principles, really starting with why we're doing this initiative on responsible carbon finance, and finishing with how we arrived at the interim principles that we are launching today. So why are we doing this responsible carbon finance initiative? Ultimately, the goal that we have is to help buyers to engage in clean cooking carbon projects with confidence. Our vision for achieving this is through a market that operates with integrity, transparency, fairness, and sustainability. We think that if we're successful in doing this, that carbon finance and other forms of associated finance will come into the sector at even greater volumes than what we've been seeing in recent years. And Dimfna has been saying some of the good news there that we know has happened in recent years around investment. Ultimately helping clean cooking companies to continue to prove their unit economics and expand their geographic reach. That will get us closer to a world where cooking dinner doesn't cook the planet. Why we launched a responsible carbon finance initiative for clean cooking. In essence, access to carbon revenue is needed to accelerate market growth. We see that companies that have carbon projects are generating higher revenue and attracting more investment than those without carbon projects. But access to carbon revenue at all will only continue if carbon credit buyers are confident in what they're buying. We see the general trend that buyer concerns are growing, particularly around integrity, also fairness, transparency of carbon credits. And whilst work is underway to improve the quality in voluntary carbon markets, we do still see gaps that exist for clean cooking. Let me add a little bit more color and context to each of those three kind of broad colored assertions that I've just made. So starting with access to carbon revenue needed to accelerate market growth. Companies that have carbon projects are generating higher revenue and attracting more investment than those without it. I think the best picture that sums this up is the chart on the right, which comes out of our most recent industry snapshot report, which should be due for release on December 14th. So bookmark that in your calendars. This picture shows what we've grouped revenue tracked going into 29 clean or improved cooking companies by their carbon status. So those with no carbon program are shown in green. Those that are generating carbon credits are in the dark blue, and those registering their POAs are in the light blue. And from this, we see that companies with a carbon program that's actively generating credits or that is currently at the pre-monitoring stage have generated 89% of the total revenue that CCA tracked in 2022. On addressing the quality concerns of carbon credit buyers and restoring their confidence, probably most people on this call are already aware of those concerns around integrity, fairness, transparency. But let's look at two bits of data that act as proxies for buyer confidence. Spot prices shown there in the green on the chart, and spot prices is in the blue line on the chart, and retirements, which are shown in the green bars. So prices of clean cooking carbon credits are almost half of what they were just 5 quarters ago. So the average price for Q2 of last year was over $10. The average price for Q3 of this year is just under $5.50. So that 46% fall is seen there. But retirements of clean cooking carbon credits is a rosier picture, though. So they've been remaining strong, and it seems that 2023 is very likely to be another record year. So I think it's 6 straight years where retirements of clean cooking carbon credits have gone up, which is interesting compared to the backdrop of a decline in overall retirements this year compared with last year. So that does indicate that buyers do remain interested in credits sourced from clean cooking projects. We know a lot of work is underway to improve quality, but we see that gaps remain for clean cooking. So if you look at the jar on the right, the balls in that jar are representative of initiatives relating to carbon credit integrity. And the liquid represents clean cooking's responsible carbon finance initiative, kind of filling the gaps that are clean cooking specific, left behind by the other initiatives. Our responsible carbon finance work seeks to complement existing action, but also to raise ambition where it's lacking. So we're not aiming to replace other valuable initiatives working on quality issues in the broader carbon markets. Rather, we're looking to build on those efforts. Okay, let's talk a bit now about how we arrived at the current set of principles. 2 things really to call out on this slide. One, we've been very careful to learn from other initiatives, both in terms of process of developing the interim principles, but also the form that they take. So to the left of the slide here on process, I suppose in establishing a steering committee of the 8 co-chairs and in kicking off a public consultation on the interim principles, we're certainly following parts of the process that VCMI used for their claims guidance, in terms of how they arrived at that claims guidance. In terms of form, so on the right of the screen, very much we've been inspired by the core humanitarian standard. I don't expect many of you on the call to be too familiar with the core humanitarian standard. I know I wasn't 6 months ago, but they made 9 commitments. We've got 12 principles, and they, in their document, show how they can be operationalized by changes to internal processes, or by external facing actions. And that, as you'll see in the thematic report, which is released today, is a style that we've looked to copy. In terms of our journey this summer, we went through a discovery phase with the working groups, of which many of you, I'm sure, who are on this call might have participated in that to some degree. So thank you for that if you did. It was supplemented by some brilliant research done by Climate Focus. A huge shout out to Climate Focus for the work that they've done in supporting us in this work this year. Very much appreciated. We took all of that input and we synthesized it into a set of principles. And again, for those of you that were involved in the working groups, you would have seen the early prototype principles that were shared in the final working group meetings earlier this summer. Now, there were 16 principles at that stage, but when we put them all together, several of them overlapped. And so what we did was we went through a process of standardization. Essentially, CCA held the pen on coming to that revised set of principles, but then we took that into a co-chairs meeting, which was held during Africa Climate Week in Nairobi. And this resulted in the current set of 12 interim principles that we are sharing with you today. Now, some of you might be wondering exactly how the evolution of the interim principles took place, how we went from 16 to 12. Well, 7 standardization filters were applied to the draft interim principles that emerged from the responsible carbon finance working groups. They are universality, they should be applicable in all circumstances. Materiality, they've got to be the most important things for us to focus on. Mutually exclusive, should be indivisible, should be independent. Transformational, they should be raising the bar and be additive to what's already going on. Specificity, so it should be specific to clean cooking. Rational, logical, I think that speaks for itself. And operationalizable, it should be actionable by one or more actors in the ecosystem. This picture gives a flavor of how we moved from the original 16 principles from the working groups to a set of 5 themes with 14 principles presented to the co-chairs, and then moving on to what we've got today. I think basically what I want to give you a sense of from this picture is that we, for each step in the evolution of the interim principles, the changes have been traceable. And if anyone has any questions about how we've moved along in that evolution, then add it to the Q&A, and or send us an email at carbon@cleancooking.org, and we'd be happy to share a bit more information. With that, Faisal, let me hand back to you to take us through the interim principles.
Thank you very much, Ronan. So I think what's important is, again, just to recap Ronan's presentation. This is not just a moral thing to do because carbon is important. It really makes good business sense for many of the companies, and we think that if we can all abide by these principles, we just simply raise the bar and improve the confidence among buyers, but also among each other, and as well as the clients that we work with. So I will take you through the basic principles, but before I do that, as Dimna mentioned, we had an amazing group of co-chairs from across academia, development partners, carbon markets, key ecosystem players within the carbon ecosystem as well. And we just want to acknowledge their incredible contribution, not just being a rubber stamp, but they were challenging, they were constructive, and they really helped guide the process. And what Ronan presented in terms of the flow through of how the principles moved through wouldn't have happened had it not been for the real direction and guidance from the co-chairs, many of whom are here. So again, for those of you who are here, thank you very much indeed for helping in this process, and we hope that you will continue with us in this journey. So now we turn to the themes with the principles. We do have 12 principles. They're clustered around 4 themes of integrity, transparency, fairness, and sustainability. This shouldn't be a surprise. These are key principles for all market development, and we think this is as important for this as others as well. So the first theme is integrity. This has been the one issue or one area that's consumed a lot of people's time and minds over the last year at least, particularly following lots of articles and so on. And so that's really top of the agenda. What does that mean? It means that project claims are evidence-based, they're case-specific and substantiated. And the 3 principles under these are that project developers, who are the kind of key actors here, use baselines that are realistic and geography-specific, and that assumptions are conservative. Again, the second principle is project developers accurately monitor fuel consumption or stove usage, and again, assumptions having been made conservative. And the third principle is project developers claim only those co-benefits that are substantiated and can be evidenced. So the core elements are very strong principles around evidence, specificity, and conservativeness. This second theme we have is on transparency, the foundation of reducing information asymmetries in the market, building trust. And what's this about? It's about non-commercially sensitive information on clean cooking carbon markets becoming accessible. We have that in commercial markets. SEC and other regulators require that. It's not so much within carbon markets, and we want to see this market reaching for what is best in other markets as well. And the 2 principles that's under this theme is that market actors are transparent about the proportion of carbon revenue reaching actors further down the value chain. And the second principle is that market actors enable buyers to reflect co-benefits in carbon credit prices. The implication here being that there are a lot of co-benefits in clean cooking that's not reflected in the prices that buyers pay for these. The third theme is one of fairness. It sort of is a segue from transparency. And this has been the one theme that's occupied a lot of people's minds, particularly in developing countries, and within Article 6 discussions. And that probably reflects the four major principles there. It's obviously an issue for project developers and voluntary market buyers as well, increasingly. And what's it about? It is that carbon projects solicit informed consent from users and share revenue fairly along clean cooking and improved cooking value chains. The first principle is that developers actively engage users in the design of projects. The issue is about active and sort of early stage engagement. The second is that developers ensure users make informed consent. So it's not good enough just to say, this is what you get, but we have an obligation to explain how the revenues would work and what they will receive. So they make informed consent on their participation at the start of the carbon project. The third principle is that project developers share carbon revenue with users in recognition for their role in generating emission reductions. So there is a moral and ethical perspective to it. And fourth is investors and intermediaries earn carbon revenue that is proportionate to the value they add and the risks they assume. So key elements here are informed consent, sharing of revenue, and along the value chain, and a risk reward that is proportionate, or reward that is proportionate to risks. The fourth theme is of sustainability, primarily because we believe that carbon revenue is a means towards something. It's not an end in itself, and therefore we ought to want to see carbon revenue not create perverse incentives in how markets currently work. So what's it about? Carbon markets complement other forms of funding, and they do no long-term harm to local clean cooking and improved cooking markets. And the first principle on this is that providers of official development assistance, ODA, and philanthropic capital ensure their funds are complementary to carbon market. So it's not just additional, but it needs to be complementary. The second is that project developers avoid creating excessive market distortion, given that distortion it happens in clean cooking and improved cooking markets. And the third is governments create an enabling environment to incentivize the development of national clean and improved cooking carbon markets. The opposite being they shouldn't disincentivize with regulations that detract investors into markets. So those are the four themes and the 12 principles. Let me go to this. So in terms of the next steps, this is the process that we'd gone through, obviously starting 6 months ago. In Q2, we really did the research. Q3, we really worked with the co-chairs to pull the interim principles together. We are now in the middle of that. We're going to spend from now until end of Q3 to do two things. One is finalize the principles by the beginning of the year or end of January, and two, in a concurrent process, engage all of you and others in the market to develop a voluntary code of conduct for project developers themselves, and we'll go through why that's important, to operationalize the principles within the project development developer community. And then we move towards looking at how these can be widely adopted and scaled, and how the principles can be integrated into other standards and regulatory bodies. To take you through each of these, the first being sort of finalizing the key, the interim principles. We are going to have a global online consultation. One of the feedback we received that while working groups were helpful, organizations felt that actually they needed to have an organizational view of this and much deeper conversation about those principles and about how these can be adapted within the organizational scenario. So we will have a global consultation process. Ronan will take us through how you can contribute to that process, and this will continue until the end of January. The second process is that came out of one of the limitations that we had with the working group process. It became clear that there weren't sufficient number of buyers, whether these are corporate buyers or public buyers, governments, involved in our process. So we are putting together a stakeholder consultation process with very specific targets to buyers to have them look through the principles, because the theory is that the principles ought to provide confidence to buyers. So this will come into the mix as well. And then we expect to finalize the principles by bringing all these inputs in by the end of January. The second part is the development of the voluntary code of conduct. We believe that many of the principles will get integrated, and we will work towards integrating it with others. But again, as Ronan was saying, that we have looked at where initiatives have really upped the game as a core part of the confidence and the trust in the sector, or a key player are the developers. And they're a collective who we believe through a voluntary code of conduct could essentially elevate their position by saying, by the way, we are not only doing the core minimum that's required by standard bodies, but we are self-regulating ourselves and holding ourselves to higher standard, so that so those who have signed up, buyers can have greater confidence around much more broader principles than just very sort of, I suppose, project level principles or credit level principles. And so in terms of the process, we're going to go through identifying best practice. Many organizations are already practicing these things. We want to have a consultation process where we take the principle and say, okay, what should the code of conduct include within those principles to take it forward, and how they can be applied within organizational context. It could be policies, it could be particular processes that people put together, it could be how you engage sort of peer review processes. It could be a whole range of things. Again, have a look at the report, the thematic report that we've published, and we will also give sort of how other sectors have used it, and that might give guidance in terms of what the voluntary code might look like. And then we're going to start thinking about how do we create a sort of a tiered system for the developers themselves, where they can see how you can come through a journey of improving standards, voluntary code of conduct within the market itself. So that we expect to kind of complete by the end of, or the third quarter of next year. This is how it would look like, that we have a concurrent process of finalizing the principles by March of 2024, and then gradually moving into the code of conduct by December 2024. We certainly want to kind of, our ambition is to try and get as far as we can by COP next year. And then, yeah, so that's it in terms of the principles and in terms of the journey moving forward. So with that, I want to open up for Q&A. And Ronan, you might, yeah.
Okay, so a couple of early questions in. Just, can this session be recorded? Do we get the PowerPoint copy after this meeting? Yes, yes. And question in from Steve Thorne. Are the users at the lower end of the value chain are users not the top of the value chain? So Steve, I think I can quickly answer that. So we did change that, the position of that in both the report and the principles. And I think we defined it in the end that users are at the lower end of the value chain. Yeah, I suppose exactly kind of the comment to put in the feedback to us with the now that the public consultation has opened up.
Just to also just say that I think the thing to focus on is on risk and reward and the issue of fairness, right? So you will have customers, for example, who contribute more to the purchase of equipment, say, for example, a solution, or are able to demonstrate they use actively. So theoretically, at least, you would expect more revenues to flow to those individuals who are making an investment in the clean cooking project, carbon project itself. So yeah, so there's some principles that will help guide, which is focused around sort of risk and reward.
Great. Couple of related questions here, Faisal. So one from a project developer, jumping into a specific one on integrity, the second principle on integrity, and asking all that have which project developers should follow this principle. Is it those that have access to fuel consumption data, or will it remain optional according to the principle? And I suppose related to that question is how will companies' compliance with the voluntary code of conduct be followed up on?
So I want to turn to Elisa to answer the question on I'm looking at Jan, I suppose it's Jan, and Tom Price. Elisa, I'm not sure whether you're able to see this. The questions, if you could take those in the first instance, and then we can.
Yeah, so I think there's two, I can answer this from two perspectives. For the principles, these are all voluntary, right? So we're not talking about mandatory rules of operation for the ecosystem. And similarly, under the 4C work, we mentioned encouraging real-time monitoring wherever possible. So the methodology that 4C is developing, which I know many of you have already heard about, it will be the first carbon methodology for clean cooking projects that's applicable to all transition scenarios, regardless of baseline or project fuels or technologies. And that will have a tiered system that incentivizes direct monitoring, but always allows for realistically conservative default values where monitoring isn't possible or feasible given small project size. And then the second question. Oh yeah, I was just about how compliance with the voluntary carbon code of conduct will be followed up on. I think you've covered that pretty well, but just to reiterate, this is voluntary at all levels, the principles themselves, as well as the code of conduct people can opt into.
So an analogy you might want to think about is what happened with cocoa on fair trade. So on cocoa, there would be different standard bodies who would regulate, for example, the quality of the chocolate and the ingredients that are there, sort of health standards and so forth. So that's all there. The Fair Trade Initiative, however, set standards which were slightly higher. And initially it was voluntary code of conducts. And I think that's the way you might want to look at it in terms of the sort of the core project level, credit level sort of regulation or standard. That's done through the compliance sort of regulatory bodies, whereas the portfolio level sort of organizational sort of initiatives aspires to higher standards that are beyond sort of much more, not micro, I don't want to say micro, but much more granular issues around quality and yeah, that we have from the standards agencies.
And maybe I'll also just add that all of the details about how compliance will be verified, if a for those who say we're going to be a silver level code of conduct adherent, all of those details will be worked out next year during the process of developing that code of conduct.
Yeah, so it's up to us to kind of pull together on this. Okay, so we now have what are the standards of profit sharing between project investors, users, and governments. Look, it's up to us. We know what percentages. So different business models have different unit economics. So the application, so you couldn't apply a single standard or single sort of percentage depending on the business model. So if you're doing biogas digesters, that has a completely different economics to what you might have for a cook stove, right? So we will have to be flexible around those economic pieces in how you structure those revenue sharing arrangements and percentages. It's up to us in the consultation process to look at these things in a very reasonable lens, and then start with something. And as we get into the practice and improve that practice moving forward. But the expectation would be that we start and that we improve over time. So it is up to us, and it will differ from place to place. Oh, there's Ronan Ferguson. So Ronan, it's a question from you. Oh, it's not.
No, it's not. It's I think my login details did the rounds. So there's a whole load of questions from me, apparently.
So how do you envision the adherence of the code of conduct would be confirmed? Is CCA another body? So we are not going to be a body certifying these. We think if we look at other sectors, so for example, the humanitarian standards, they have created a self-regulating body that initially was facilitated by one of the humanitarian agencies. That could be one sort of way of looking at it. There may be a different way as well. So that's, again, going to be part of the process that we use to define what that looks like moving forward. But we will be looking to other models where they've done these things and drawing on that to see what might work here. And then, of course, through the consultation process and the advisory committee, we will come back with something that has sort of the widest application and acceptance in terms of moving this forward. Could you elaborate on the principles of buyer to reflect the co-benefits and transparency? Yeah, so I think I mentioned, if I've understood the question, the principle there, which is around information, that a lot of people, there is an assumption that the co-benefits create these charismatic carbon that generates better prices, but actually the evidence doesn't suggest that yet. It's unclear, let's put it that way. But we strongly believe that actually in having that conversation, a clear information to be able to say, this is what the carbon emission reduction is, and these are the co-benefits, and there's a valuation of the co-benefits, and that information might help in framing better prices from the buyers themselves. I think if that's your question, that's sort of our response. Let us deliver meeting. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Good. Hi, Neera. You mentioned that key buyers should engage in the co-create phase. Would you consider including producers? But very good. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. We hadn't thought about it, but I think it will be important to have that stakeholder perspective to come through. So yes, thank you. Well noted. David, it appears that there are movements towards more data and an extreme recording every cooking event, possibly live, right? So this is the digitalization process. The sector seems to be moving towards big data and IoT. What does the code of conduct say regarding the use, storage, safety of such? Excellent question. It doesn't say much, so it's something to.
The code of conduct doesn't exist yet, so it says nothing about it, but it should, and therefore will. And this is the kind of input that we need to be seeing what the trade-offs are. So,
yeah. conservative and realistic should always go together. Only conservative can be unrealistic. Yeah, well taken. Eliza, any comment on that?
Nope, you noted I said them both together.
Okay. Right.
No disagreement here.
Reference to principles should be consistent, transparent, clean cooking, fairness, reference to clean cooking and improved cooking.
This is a language consistency
yeah,
recommendation.
Okay. Well noted, well taken. Many of the principles named are already requirements established best practice in VCM, informed consent, while others are quite revolutionary revenue sharing with users. What's the rationale for including principles that are already within VCM? And how do you plan to emphasize the truly new principles? Ronan, do you want to come back with, I mean, that's a good thing because we want to have this integrated, but Ronan, over to you on this question.
Yeah, so let me just try and find what that question. Would you mind just repeating it, Faisal?
So this is the fact that there are a lot of the principles are shared with VCM already on informed consent, for example, while others are fairly revolutionary revenue sharing. That's fine. So I think the one question is, if you have sort of common principles, how do you emphasize the truly new principles?
I guess the question around how it's not about emphasizing truly new principles. It's we've put principles out there into the world now that we hope get taken up, but ultimately how they are defined as being taken up is really for the people, the organizations and the institutions, the project developers to define that. So for the ones that are seen as transformational, like revenue sharing, this has come out of our consultation over the summer. So we know it's important for us to be showing action and progress against this, but we've been very careful not to say thou shalt do it this way to show that it's being done in a revolutionary way. Really, we want to hear from you all how that could be done, and maybe in one scenario we get absolutely zero uptake of it, and that's going to be interesting in and of itself. And in that world we move forward from there. In another world, other project developers pull this and sees it towards them, and they share revenues with end users as per how is already happening with ATEC and their pilots, for example. And maybe buyers of carbon credits respond to that particular way of interpreting that principle very positively. Maybe they don't, but in that instance where they do interpret it very positively, then perhaps that's something for us to build on and say, well, that seems to be something that the market is looking favorably at. So perhaps that becomes the de facto way of doing it. But ultimately, this is we've evolved the principles to get to this point. We will evolve the code of conduct hereafter. So yeah, good that parts of it are seen as revolutionary, but really in terms of how their action, that's all still to be created, co-created.
Thank you, Ronan. So Saroj, I mean, there's lots of comments about fairness. I think just thematically, all well taken. I think there's some really helpful inputs in terms of the next phase from Saroj, and then Alessandro. I think there's questions around that which Eliza you could take on. I think you've mentioned it already, and I think there's a good feedback on how compliance can be linked to premium credits, or how adherence to good standards leads to better prices, or can command better prices over time. I see. So while I look at the other questions, Eliza, do you want to just take Alessandro's comment? I don't know whether you can see it, which is that conservative and realistic should always go together. Only conservative can be. Yep.
Yeah, we hit that one already, but I propose answering the question about how will these principles help new entrants into the system.
You got
What do you want to take that?
Yeah. So what? Yeah,
sure.
but
So just on the question of how these principles will help new entrants, I suppose the first thing to acknowledge is that, you know, there is an issue here with financial, technical, regulatory barriers that are keeping new entrants from accessing carbon markets, and that you know the concentration in a smaller number of established market players is something to be aware of. I think that you know that we've got themes around transparency and sustainability that can help new entrants. The one around providers of ODA and philanthropic capital, ensuring their funds are complementary with carbon finance. That's, you know, suggests that investors and donors can act around helping new players come into clean cooking carbon markets.
Yeah, so I think just to reinforce, you will see from there are a bulk of the principles around project developers, but there are really important principles on the obligation side, which is on the other side, as Ronan was saying, say for funders and so on. So particularly public funders have a really important role to play in making carbon markets fairer, more transparent, more sustainable, as well as markets that enable sort of level the playing field so that it creates or lowers the entry barriers for new entrants. Now, some of these principles where there are some obligations for ecosystem players can become principles or points of advocacy and points of engagement with grant funders or public players that are essential for making markets. So so that's a conversation we will need to have. I don't know whether there's anybody from development partners here. You may want to kind of put some of your chat comments around that, how you would make it easier for people to enter. But we will certainly be targeting development partners or those who are not project developers to see how they can be helpful in this particular process itself.
There are a couple questions about the revenue sharing related. So, you know, does giving away stoves for free count as revenue sharing? We've talked about kind of how whether subsidized stove or fuel costs are part of revenue sharing. And then there's a follow-up question about if the code of conduct if we expect that the eventual code of conduct that does not yet exist will say anything about stove and price dumping and what would be considered there. So on both ends, can you consider that as part of revenue sharing, and how do you not distort the market?
I think so there are two principles here. One is that you should do no harm. I mean, it may appear to be contradictory, but I think it is a fine balance that not just in clean cooking and carbon, but every market has to sort of straddle, which is how do you achieve sort of revenue sharing with stoves, and that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do, but do it in ways that you're not distorting a market, so that when the carbon revenue stops, for example, that you know that it creates a disincentive for the same customers to then pay for something in future, right? So these are sort of balanced acts. There are no kind of hard rule sort of solutions around it, but it is something that the collective, the industry, has to come up with and has to provide a sort of a credible answer to moving forward. And only those who would abide by that would then be recognized as abiding by those standards when they come together. Think so I think I see the most of the themes have been more or less covered. If there hasn't been any coverage of your questions, please, we will look through them again, and if we haven't covered them properly, we will come back to you. But I think with that, I
see one more, Faisal, which has got a lot of likes, is Nick's question there around, you know, defining proportionate revenue. And perhaps it's more appropriate for us just to, you know, let me just jot to it. It would make more sense for the host party governments to decide on equitable revenue shares, as they will under Article 6, and then for project developers to decide whether or not to, you know, operate projects in those jurisdictions or not. Seems unnecessary and over complex to do it here. And I suppose that is an approach that could be taken, and we can see which project developers don't want to define it themselves and would prefer to sit and wait for host governments to define it. Is a legitimate approach, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's one view. I think there are pluses and minuses to all of these things, because I think governments are also trying to figure things out themselves. And there may be an argument that by setting a standard by themselves, you're able to provide a signal to governments as well. So yeah, I mean, it's something for discussion, and I think we should just take the likes as an issue that we should probably spend a bit more time drilling down on to make sure that we answer it properly. So with that, thank you very much. I want to now hand over to Ronan in terms of the call to action for the consultation process. Over to you, Ronan.
Great. No, thank you, Faisal. So the immediate next step for this initiative is to help us move from having a set of interim principles to principles. And we're doing this through the period of public consultation. So this consultation window is open as of today, and will run through to the end of January of next year. Please feel free to scan that QR code whilst I'm talking. That will land you through at the appropriate CCA webpage, where you'll get some of the background information on responsible carbon finance. You'll see the principles listed there and the process that we are going through that Faisal walked us through. You can download a feedback template from the website. That's a Word document located up at the top there in the About section. And that contains all of the principles and some guiding questions for you to react to. And if you could kindly send that back to us at carbon@cleancooking.org, that would be very much appreciated. An advisory council is going to be formed in the new year to review and approve suggested changes that come in from this process. This is the web page that if you click through, you'll see. So the Word document is downloadable from this link. The interim principle thematic report is accessible from the second link. You can get to the principles pretty quickly. You can download the principles in a PDF format. If you prefer to socialize that, you are most welcome to. And then a little bit about the process as well. And again, the opportunity to download the thematic report, which gives a lot of good context around what the principles are, but also the background for why they are important and where they're grounded. And the interim principles can be downloaded from the page as well. So with that, Faisal, let me hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Ronan. So really helpful questions. I think all to say, we just want to thank you very much indeed for all the contributions you've made in the past, all the contributions you're going to make in future. Just a few notes of thanks, obviously, to the co-chairs again for helping us through this process. As Ronan was saying, we will be bringing together constituting an advisory committee. Feel free to engage on that, to suggest organizations, individuals, that yourselves even, and then we'll take that into consideration. We also want to thank Climate Focus, who helped us with the report. So thank you very much with the Climate Focus team. And again, many of the people who we had reached out to for much more one-to-one consultation on the principles. Again, we thank you for that, for that support and encouragement through that process. So with that, thank you very much indeed, and really looking forward to engaging as we move forward towards finalizing the principles by the end of January. And if you have any questions, the email is there. Please come back to us through that email. Thank you again for your time. Thank you for the CCA colleagues and our interpreter. And with that, we close the webinar.